the genesis of this program. We all know that we're stymied from going to the movies that I usually provide at the Wapaka Library from September through May and the first Thursday at 1:30. Since we can't gather together anymore, we started looking for ways in which to make this get out to you anyway, and decided to do the best we could by having some lectures. I did one for the Winchester Academy, November 9th of 2020, which you may have seen on the Western genre.
Jack, you got muted.
Pick up.
Okay, can you hear me now, folks? Can they hear me now?
Yes, we have you now.
Somebody nod. Can you hear me now, guys?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
If we're okay, thank you. We just had a little technical glitch there. So forgive us if those happen. We're new to this kind of thing today. So anyway, we're one day late because of the weather, but we're going to talk today about revisiting the classic mystery genres. And I want to start by reminding you that our focus is what our focus is. Our focus is really not on the novels, and it is not on the television programs, though we'll mention some of those in passing. What we were on today is the classic era films, largely those produced in Hollywood, some in Great Britain, that indeed were made during the silent period or the classic period. Well, what period are we talking about? The silent era, of course, ended in 1927 with The Jazz Singer. Scholars then say the classic era ran until 1968. With the end of the production code, we began the modern era, and in 2000, the contemporary. So following Dwight McDonald, the film scholar of great fame years ago, we will define the classic era as 1927 to 1968. And because we can't cover all the mysteries in about a 45 or 50-minute talk, my focus today is going to be on the detective or mystery genre, emphasizing particularly the series of the classic era from 27 to 68. I need to mention at the beginning that I took some of my favorite quotations and ideas from Stanley J. Solomon with his book Beyond Formula in 1976, and from Thomas Schatz's Hollywood Genres, 1981. These remain standard texts in the field. I'm going to cover a lot of ground today, and as I mention various series and go along, I will be recommending some movies. So if you have a chance to grab a pencil and paper, you might be able to get some of the titles down. I think we're ready to go with the first slide. If you're ready with that, Laura, yes, I can see them in here now. So let's start with a couple of slides first, and then I'll be more specific about what a genre is and what I mean by series. This is a slide showing 3 images from the Philo Vance detective series. This series starts with the Canary murder case in 1929. In your upper left of your screen, you see the lurid sort of poster with Louise Brooks there in her feathered outfit. She played a singer called the Canary in this Paramount picture released in 1929. It was first in the series, and it was really started as a silent film. Then they went back and added talking sequences. So it's a creaky kind of curio to watch. At any rate, you'll notice then the next one over there, William Powell on the Kennel murder case. That's a Philo Vance production as well. William Powell again in that. And then below, Eugene Pallette, William Powell, and E.H. Calvert, District Attorney Markham. So what we want to notice here is straightforwardly Eugene Pallette, and notice the shadows that are cast back there. If you don't know Eugene Pallette, he played Detective Sergeant Heath in most of these movies, and he has that gravelly voice I'll try to imitate. Well, Mr. Vance, we certainly solved this case, didn't we? And William Powell, of course, the urbane, debonair gentleman who played the Thin Man in a series we'll talk about later. Notice how the shadows are cast on the wall and back in this publicity shot for the 3 of them. I wanted to show this first to mention this as a great example of an early series. The series went on quite some time, all the way through 1947 with Philo Vance's Gamble, produced by Producers Releasing Corporation and starring Alan Curtis. All of these were written by S.S. Van Dyne, the pseudonym of Willard Huntington Wright. And I wanted to be careful to suggest one of the best of the series as I go each time. And on this one, I'm going to recommend the Kennel murder case. If you have an opportunity to watch only one of these Philo Vance movies, this one is available pretty easily. And I think the library should be able to get it. Library should have it. You should be able to find this fairly easily. A great series, the Philo Vance series by Willard Huntington Wright. Let's go to the next slide now, Laura. Are we ready for the next slide? Yes, this one is from Ellery Queen, the series. You may recognize Ralph Bellamy. This is a shot from Ellery Queen, Master Detective, 1940. From the left, Charlie Grapewin, the actor who was notable in playing in The Grapes of Wrath as Pa Jode. But in this series, he played the father of Ellery Queen, the detective. There's Ellery in the center, played by Ralph Bellamy, and standard character actor James Burke, often playing the not so bright cop, is shown on your right there. And the three of them are playing out this scene in this movie, Ellery Queen, Master Detective. The series ran from 1935 to 1942. The Columbia logo at the bottom, talking about 1945, is just a Columbia marker for when they released that particular picture. Anyway, not the movie, but that particular shot. So anyway, what I'm trying to talk about here is Ellery Queen was not only the name of the star, that was the name of the pseudonym of the two authors who wrote all the Ellery Queen mysteries. There were 9 of them produced by Republic and Columbia over a 7-year period. Ralph Bellamy starred in 4. They are, in my view, the best, but you also had William Gargan and Eddie Quillen and others attempting this role. The later ones particularly have lurid and similar titles: A Close Call for Ellery Queen, A Desperate Chance for Ellery Queen, and my favorite, Enemy Agents Meet Ellery Queen, which rounded out the series in wartime, 1942. So now we have examples so far of 2 different genre series in the detective genre. Let's go leave Ellery Queen up for just a moment, if you will, Laura, and talk about what I mean by a genre film. Whoops, we're too far ahead, Laura. You can do that, but I thought we'd leave Ellery Queen for a moment. Okay, the genre film is a title, used by film scholars to talk about a very specialized type of movie. You probably recognize this when I tell you that some of these movies are Westerns, horror pictures, detective pictures, mystery films, all of those, and you can even throw in romances, musicals, science fiction. They are specialized types of films that are not really what you would call general interest dramas. How do I differentiate? A general interest drama is a movie that tells us something about the human condition. It is something that, while it may be a film that may be part of a genre in sort of, is not really what we mean by genre film. Now that's confusing enough. Let me try to explain it a little better here. A genre film doesn't really cause us to think about a lot more. It is done for entertainment. Aristotle said that a drama begins when a problem arises, and a drama ends when the problem is resolved. That's a perfect definition of a genre film. The detective gets a case, the detective solves the case. The cowboy hero rides into a town, there's a despot, he gets rid of the despot and the villains associated with that guy, and then we have the cowboy ride into the sunset. Western genre, detective genre. In the horror movies, usually a monster appears. Lately, in the contemporary era, they are somewhat more sympathetic. Some of them were also in the past. A monster appears, the monster is dealt with, the end of the story. In a general interest drama, we are told about the human condition. We enter the lives of these people. We talk about Mildred Pierce, for example. We get to know her. And so we stay with her, and there a murder is resolved, but that's only part of the story. What we're interested in is Mildred Pierce as an individual, her daughter as a villain. We think about what will happen to these characters years later. Not so in a genre film. Whether it's a Western or a detective movie, it is intended just to give us entertainment. Many of these films very short, very brisk. They move right along, and that is a genre film. Not an open film, as film critics say, in which life goes on afterward, and we can imagine it before, but indeed a closed film in which once the problem is resolved, we put aside our popcorn sacks, we leave the theater, we might smile a little bit, but we're not really thinking about it for a very long time. So that's a genre film. Now we're talking about what is a series film. And here we'll put up the poster that comes next, if you would, Laura, for The Lone Wolf. Okay, The Lone Wolf Meets a Lady. Before we get to that specific poster, let me give you a little bit about what a series is. Because as I said today, I'm trying to confine this because of the vast array of topics that we could describe under mysteries. I'm trying to confine this to the series and the genre series. So a series is not just one movie and maybe a sequel. A series is usually defined as 3 or more in which the characters continue, so that you have the Lone Wolf, the Falcon, Ellery Queen, Philo Vance, Sherlock Holmes, Charlie Chan. They continue, and the supporting characters largely continue. Here in The Lone Wolf Meets a Lady, Jean Muir is the lady in question. She's in this one. Often the ladies, the women changed, but Constance in 9 of the 15 Lone Wolf pictures, where Eric Blore as Jameson the butler in the center, and Warren William as the Lone Wolf himself, Michael Lanyard off to the right in the natty dresser and so forth. So you had to have a series. To be a series, it had to have at least 3, and it had to continue over a period of years usually, and it had to have sustaining characters. Now the actors might change. It wasn't just Basil Rathbone that played Sherlock Holmes, but that's the best known of the series. There were others, and we'll talk about that a little bit as we go. And of course, there were other formats besides the detective. There were lots of series made during the 30s and 40s, particularly. Just to name a few, Blondie, Bomba the Jungle Boy. Remember any of these? Tarzan, you have long memories. Dr. Kildare, Andy Hardy, Maisie, The Crime Doctor, all across all genres. And that doesn't even get us into Hopalong Cassidy, Red Ryder, the various cowboy series with Roy usually playing Roy Rogers, and all of his characters pretty much staying the same. Gabby Hayes for a while, Smiley Burnett for a while, and Andy Devine for a while, but nevertheless, very similar series format, B-Western series. Jungle Jim, we could go on. So now we look back at The Lone Wolf Meets a Lady specifically. What about The Lone Wolf? An interesting series, all made by Columbia between 1935 and 49. The books had been written by Louis Joseph Vance in the 19-teens and going forward a little bit into the 1920s, and they made silent movies out of these. And therefore, when they started the sound series in the classic era, the last silent movie had been made in 26. But we started in 1935 with The Lone Wolf Returns. And that, instead of Warren William, starred the suave and debonair Melvin Douglas. Francis Lederer then picked it up for The Lone Wolf in Paris, and then The Lone Wolf Spy Hunt. So just as we've recommended the Kennel murder case with Philo Vance, and we've recommended Ellery Queen Master Detective as the best of that series, let's recommend not the one we're showing on the screen as it happens, but the first one with Warren William, which is the Lone Wolf Spy Hunt. I think if you have a chance to watch that, you'll enjoy it a lot. The Lone Wolf was a retired master jewel thief who had reformed, and had gone to work for the police, but he still retained his old skills, his old tricks, and his old butler, who used to be a villain right along with him. So the character's name was Michael Lanyard. The butler's name was Jameson, but always he was referred to as the Lone Wolf. And the police never seemed to be sure exactly whose side he was on. And almost every episode, there are some murders. This one deals with thefts of jewelry, necklaces, strings of pearls, and so forth. So now I turn just a moment away from the Lone Wolf into a series of cards that we're going to show on the screen. I don't know if you'll want to make the notes, and I know you won't commit these to memory, but we want to talk about Willard Huntington Wright. We're ready for that slide, Laura. Some Rules of the Game by Willard Huntington Wright, 1928. This is indeed the author of the Kennel murder case and all the other Philo Vance. He wrote 12 books. They were all the Blank murder case, the Benson, the Garden, the Dragon, the Canary, the Kennel. They all have 6 letters except for one, which he wrote for one famous actress of the day. Those of you with long memories or Turner Classic Movie watchers, the Gracie Allen murder case, in which Gracie Allen actually appears with her boyfriend, George Burns. So that was, you want to see a detective stymied, watch Warren William get chased around by Gracie Allen's logic in the Gracie Allen murder case. That's another one you might want to watch if you get a chance. Wright was born in 1888, died early in 1939. I think you'd be interested. He's in the Oxford Companion to American Literature and a number of literary sources, but not for writing these so much. He was quite a dilettante and a European art critic, and even did some painting himself. He talked about futurism and cubism in his works. He wrote in 1913, Europe After 8:15 in collaboration with the famous writer H.L. Mencken. Modern Painting followed in 1925, The Future of Painting in 1923, but then Willard Huntington Wright became quite ill. And he had to turn instead to something he could do from his bedside, and he started writing the Philo Vance mystery novels. So after he got started with the Benson murder case in 1926, all of these followed. And as he wrote these novels, he became disenchanted with a lot of the mystery novels that were out at that time, because these mystery novels were not following rules that he thought played fair with the reader. So he wrote 20 of them, 20 rules of the game, and published these in 1928. But I'm just going to quickly go over 5 of them that I have here that I thought were of greatest interest to you. So Laura will go slide by slide, and rule number 1 by S.S. Van Dyne. Are we ready? The reader must have equal opportunity with the detective for solving the mystery. Think about that just a minute. It seems so simple. Rule number 1, the reader must have equal opportunity, or the viewer, if we say in case of the movies. For a puzzle to be enjoyable and solvable, it has to be fair and logical. We're not very interested if we don't have any chance. Ask anybody who reads these mysteries in the books or views them on the screen. You want a chance to see what happened. You want to have equal opportunity, as he says, with the detective. Rule 2 is similar. All of these follow a similar trajectory. Ready for rule 2, Laura? No willful tricks or deceptions must be played on the reader, other than those played legitimately, he continues in longer form, by the criminal on the detective himself. So if the criminal tries to fool the detective, that's all right, but the author should not be fooling the reader. Let's try number 3. The culprit must be determined by logical deductions, a la Sherlock Holmes, not by accident or coincidence or some, 11th hour unmotivated confession. We just have to have logical deductions in order for the audience or the detective to identify the villain in such a way that we will feel we have been played fair with. The famous author Agatha Christie, in The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, I'm certainly not going to give away the solution, but had an unusual solution to the crime. And people cried foul sometimes in the press. But Dorothy L. Sayers, another famous writer of the day, came to Christie's defense and said, fair enough, and fooled you. Go back and read it again, and you will see that you should have realized who did it all the time. Let's go to number 4, the mystery. The mystery, number 4, Laura. A sense of reality, thank you, is essential to the detective novel. The task of the writer is a working of familiar materials into a difficult riddle. So the mystery should be plausibly grounded in reality. Some of these detective movies get pretty thin in their use of logic and reality. A spring gun used that nobody can hear, a poisoned cigarette, for example, where the person dies from that. These devices would be anathema to Willard Huntington Wright. What he particularly didn't like was throwing in something toward the end that the reader could not possibly have known. And he criticized authors for doing something like in the last chapter, revealing that someone was colorblind and that was the solution. Never liked that. And he was right about that. It's not fair, and the reader wants to be able to have an equal chance. The last of these rules, number 5, for that last one, Laura, is if the reader or viewer, we'll say readers, should go back over the book after reading it the first time, they would, as in Dorothy Sayers' comment, find that the solution had been there all the time if only they had had sufficient shrewdness to grasp it. In other words, the superior writer will place the solution right in front of us, evidently from the very beginning. In so many cases, it's beautifully done. And then like a magic act, we lose track of it. You know, magicians thrive on diverting us, so our attention is taken over here and not front and center. And that's the same way with mystery writers and mystery directors. So we move forward. And by the way, notice almost all of these come from literary sources. Have you noticed that so far? Ellery Queen books, Ellery Queen movies, Lone Wolf books, Lone Wolf movies, Philo Vance books, and you can go on like that. Charlie Chan, Earl Derr Biggers, Sherlock Holmes, of course, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Now we'll turn away from this and to another slide of a short detective series. You may not be familiar with this actress, Jean Parker. She was very vivacious and very popular in her day, and her long life, 1915 to 2005, gave her some opportunity to tell us about her life in interviews. She was born in Butte, Montana in 1915, and she made a lot of movies, but you still may not remember her. Her last one in 1966, character part, Apache Uprising in the Western genre. But she might best be remembered to viewers today as Beth in the Katharine Hepburn version of Little Women, 1933. So if you do indeed want to see an example of Jean Parker's work, she plays the role that Margaret O'Brien was to play in 49 in the same story, Little Women. But in our case today, we're recognizing her. So it is a masculine genre, but not entirely. Here was a detective that was a lady in just 3 or 4 mysteries, Detective Kitty O'Day. That's indeed the name of the first one. And while they're not particularly good, that one's probably the best of the lot, and a fluffy one in which she and her boyfriend, played by Peter Cookson, solve these murder mysteries. Also other titles, her 35 films, 4 of these were hers in this series: One Body Too Many, I Live on Danger, and Adventures of Kitty O'Day. One of her other notable last roles was in support of Gregory Peck in the Western The Gunfighter in 1950. We'll go to another example now, to the next slide, and look at another woman who played an important part in the mystery series. You recognize this lady? You might say first, Bonita Granville, or you might say Nancy Drew, because Bonita Granville brought Carolyn Keene's Nancy Drew to the screen. Nancy was quite the character, as you know, lots of vivacity, and she and her boyfriend, Ted, solved lots of crimes in that long-running book series by Carolyn Keene, pseudonym for another writer, and for a group of writers toward the end. At any rate, Nancy Drew detective, Nancy Drew reporter, Nancy Drew troubleshooter, and my personal favorite, 1940, the last one, Nancy Drew and the Hidden Staircase, directly from one of Carolyn Keene's books. And I think you'll enjoy any of those. You can get a DVD which has all 4 of them on it. And I think you might enjoy just looking at that. She had some ability, you know, besides being just Nancy Drew. She made a lot of other movies, television appearances, stage appearances. Bonita Granville got an Oscar nomination for being a malicious child in These Three, which was a reworking of William Wellman's William Wyler, reworking of The Children's Hour. And that was made in 1936. So it was a version called These Three. And then the other thing is Bonita Granville, you might be interested in this, married a very wealthy man named Jack Rather, who among all his other oil properties and what have you, also had the rights to Lassie and the Lone Ranger. And as a result, Bonita Granville played in the Lassie series, and she played in her last movie, The Lone Ranger, a film made in 1956 in color. But in the meantime, once Jack Rather died, she was left a very wealthy woman and in charge of many of his assets. Let's move on back to yet another series, The Saint, which you may be familiar with, which is our next slide, Laura. And here we have The Saint appearing. These were written by Leslie Charteris, one of the most prolific of the writers on this kind of series. On the left of this shot, Jonathan Hale as the chief inspector saying goodbye to him as he boards a plane for further adventures. Lewis Hayward as the Saint, character's name is Simon Templar. He's on an airplane in 1938 in this RKO production. Shortly after this movie, the very next one, George Sanders took over the role and played the Saint in 5 of these. But interestingly enough, this series went from 38 to 54, and Lewis Hayward only played the Saint twice. The first one, The Saint in New York, and the last one in 54, The Saint's Girl Friday. All between, they had different people playing the Saint, but again, the same supporting characters, the inspector and so forth. You'll remember that later, I said we'd mention TV and books in passing, that later Roger Moore played the Saint in a long-running color television series. And as late as the contemporary period, well, the modern period, 1997, I think, Val Kilmer starred in a picture called The Saint, based on this character, just a one-off picture with fairly little relation to the earlier Saint pictures. So not considered part of the series, but of interest for fans of the Saint. All right, let's move on to one more. This one you may recognize is In Desperate Trouble. Dick Tracy is in bad shape in this still from Dick Tracy's G-Men, released in 1939. Ralph Byrd is playing Dick Tracy, and Irving Pichel is at the door as Dr. Zarnoff. This was interesting because Dick Tracy was the hero not only of a film series that started with RKO in 1945, but earlier than that, as in this movie, the star of 4 serials. Dick Tracy, 15 chapters, 1937. Dick Tracy Returns in 38. Dick Tracy's G-Men in 39. Dick Tracy versus Crime Incorporated, 1941. Ralph Byrd played Dick Tracy in all of these Republic serials. And then he took the last 2, Morgan Conway in the first 2 movies for RKO, and back to Ralph Byrd for the last 2. So Ralph Byrd is the definitive Dick Tracy. These serials were wonderful for kids, especially the G-Men, particularly really good, lots of good stunt work, David Sharp and others of those famous stuntmen. And you might be interested to know that the starlet at the time who went on to win an Oscar for The Song of Bernadette and become a major Hollywood star was, of course, Jennifer Jones. She played Dick Tracy's love interest, and she's supposed to come through that door, or the first other person that does, and Dick Tracy's going to get it. But since this is a serial, of course, he gets out of it, despite being gagged and tied and bound hand and foot. These movies in 1945, when we move past the serials, have lurid titles of their own, past the first one, which is Dick Tracy versus Cue Ball, Dick Tracy's Dilemma, Dick Tracy Meets Gruesome, and that was Boris Karloff playing Gruesome in that one. So we'll leave Dick Tracy up for a moment and say another word about the private detective genre. Dick, of course, was a public detective. He was a cop, a servant of the citizens. But the private detectives were an interesting lot, and they, of course, characterized like the Lone Wolf and like Ellery Queen, who dabbled, and Nero Wolfe and others. These are the ones who would learn something as they went along. And I'll just phrase it this way, as Solomon says, the immediate narrative core of this genre remains. A highly skilled professional detective is hired to do something, along the way discovers some crime in the course of his or her investigation, and solves the crime, often solving multiple crimes. So we have private detectives, we have public detectives. The next one is another cop, just as Dick Tracy was. And we will go to this next slide, if you will, Laura, a poster for Castle in the Desert. You are looking with the gun and the white outfit at Sidney Toler, who was the second Charlie Chan. The others that you see there, Arlene Whelan and Douglas Dumbrill, also in the picture. Notice one thing that happens with all of these posters: the Lone Wolf Meets a Lady, Castle in the Desert, Technicolor posters, always for black and white movies. These genre films were always invariably in black and white movies. So, the Dick Tracy that I mentioned, the favorite of that would be the serial with the G-Men that we saw. The best of the movies is simply Dick Tracy. I forgot that. Castle in the Desert is the Charlie Chan movie that I'm going to recommend. It was the final entry in the 20th Century Fox series of Chan movies. Charlie Chan, we must stop and say a special word about, is particularly out of favor these days because of a number of things that relate, of course, to the unfortunate stereotyping of certain races, which neither I nor the library nor anybody associated with this broadcast endorses. But at the time these movies were made, and we have to remember that we're looking at historical artifacts, there was a different attitude about what was being made and produced. We might find that attitude regrettable, we might find it inexcusable, but it is a part of history. And I think we should acknowledge some of the mistakes we would say today that were probably made were pretty egregious. For example, Charlie Chan, through a series of 45 movies, the longest in number of series, the longest, what I'm trying to say is the greatest number of individual entries of any series we're discussing today, or most of any series in any genre. Charlie Chan made 45 movies. The first ones by Warner Oland, who made 17 films. Well, he was born in Sweden. He's playing the role, frankly, in what they today call yellowface, which is regrettable. Then Sidney Toler, who followed here, played Charlie Chan in 22 movies, 11 for 20th Century Fox and 11 for Monogram. He was not Swedish, but he was born in Warrensburg, Missouri. So you can figure that this was indeed a ruse and a disguise, and that his eyes were made to appear slanted and his eyebrows were accentuated and so forth. And Roland Winters in the final 6 for Monogram. Those are pretty bad movies, particularly. If you want to see a Charlie Chan movie, try Castle in the Desert. It is the last entry in the 20th Century Fox series. Behind that curtain in 1929 was the first for Fox. Soon as we got into that era, the last for Warner Oland is another good one, Charlie Chan in Monte Carlo. And the other one I'd recommend, Charlie Chan at the Opera. So Charlie Chan at the Opera or Castle in the Desert. Now they did cast, next slide please, Laura. The studio did cast an Oriental Asian gentleman, Victor Sen Young, as one of Charlie Chan's youngsters. They almost always had number 1, number 2, number 3 son appear in these. This is a shot from Castle in the Desert. Just wanted to contrast that with the fake makeup on Sidney Toler and obviously the actual person in Sen Young, a good actor in his own right. Next slide, please, Laura. This is our last one about Charlie Chan. I always like to include something backstage in all of these presentations to remind you that the movies are trying to fool us, and they're in the business of illusion and reality. They try to create reality, but in fact, it is all an illusion. We see what they want us to see. Backstage, however, is a different story. Here we are on the set of Charlie Chan at the Wax Museum, released by 20th in 1940. Sidney Toler in Chan costume and black hat, standing at the left, while there is a pause in the filming so that some niceties can be discussed about the performance. Seated, talking directly to Sidney Toler, is the director, Lynn, Lynn Shores, the gentleman seated there with a script on his lap, giving some dialogue coaching and directional coaching to Charlie Chan. To the right of him, you can see Sen Young, who appeared in this movie as well. He is right there in between the other people. I don't have all of them identified, nor need we. I will point out that the woman on the set, in those days, I'm sorry to say that women were sometimes relegated to more menial roles than they are able to play today when many are fine directors, actresses, producers. But here is what we would then call a script girl. Today, that would be a script manager. Seated there, you can see the white shoes, and you can see that she has a script and a pen. So she's taking notes on what Lynn Shores is saying to Charlie Chan, making annotations for later additions or corrections to the script. If you look carefully, you can see on the floor the wires leading from her device back to Charlie Chan's feet and around behind him, and all the camera, the lighting, the camera angles, the way they had to pick up the microphone and to disguise things, and so that you would not see any of that. And I thought you might just find that interesting. And since we're covering a lot of ground, we'll move right along to pick up yet another of the famous sleuths of this era. Next slide, please, Laura. This one will be the Falcon. The Falcon in Danger. When Leslie Charteris wanted more money for the Saint series, RKO Radio decided to start their own series and turn to the works of a cheaper author, a prolific one named Michael Arlen. And so they started this series of The Falcon. The Falcon is very similar to the Saint. He is a person who has turned from a life of crime, just like the Lone Wolf and the Saint, and is now investigating for the police. But the police are never quite sure whose side he's on. The first four starred George Sanders. That was good because he had been in RKO's series of the Saint movies. And then Sanders wanted out of the series and went on to bigger and better movies, and they had to have a replacement. So they chose Tom Conway. The virtue of that was that he was George Sanders's actual real life brother. They're very similar. They have the same kind of oily, ingratiating British speech pattern. And this made a good choice in The Falcon's brother, the one I would recommend, fourth in the series. George Sanders turns over the role to his brother, Tom Conway, who plays most of the rest of the series. The last three with a man named John Calvert. Note again the colorful poster and three women featured in the supporting cast. And yet it's a black and white movie and only runs about an hour and a few minutes. But try The Falcon's brother, 1942, and they're always moved fast. They were very popular. The next shot we have here, Laura, is a head and shoulders of Tom Conway, who indeed played the Falcon, but he had other roles to play. I wanted to mention him a little because we haven't stopped on too many of our actors to say a word about them. He was born of British parents in St. Petersburg, Russia. His brother was George Sanders, and his real name is Thomas Charles Sanders. Dates are 1904 to 67. You might have seen him, Lady Be Good, Rio Rita, One Touch of Venus, Prince Valiant, The Seventh Victim. I think fans of Walt Disney will remember him pretty well if you like the movie 101 Dalmatians. You get the real trivia on this broadcast, folks. He plays the voiceover of the collie who takes the little Dalmatian puppies to safety in the barn as they try to get away from the villains and make their way back to London across the ice and snow. He is the voice of the collie. It is about his last film performance. From 52 to 53 to 54, he played Mark Saber in a TV series. Now we go to one of the most famous of all for one shot in the next slide, Laura, and this is After the Thin Man. Of course, Asta, William Powell, and Myrna Loy in a publicity shot based on After the Thin Man, the second in the series. The Thin Man series lasted from 1936 to 47. always had Myrna Loy, Asta, and William Powell, but had only 6 movies. So for all of that time, they were very successful. And the first, The Thin Man, the one I would recommend that you see, it's easy to get. It shows on Turner Classic Movies and other channels a fair amount. And the library has The Thin Man, I do believe. But The Thin Man was nominated for Best Picture when it came out, and Powell for Best Actor. They were always all 4, the first 4, directed by W.S. Van Dyke, and Dashiell Hammett wrote the novel on which this was based. You might notice also that it's a married couple here that solves the crimes. So the Thin Man, again, is a sign of a shady character sometimes, but the police have come to accept him as being on their side. And those, of course, very enjoyable movies. Now we come to perhaps the most famous sleuth of all. We're going to talk about 2 series of his. And let us go to the next, if you will, slide, which is Sherlock Holmes on screen. And I don't know if you know this series, but it's a good series of 5 movies starring Arthur Wantner as Sherlock Holmes, pictured with his pouch and pipe, standing there in Holmes attire, and Ian Fleming, the actor, no relation to the James Bond Ian Fleming. And this is Ian Fleming as Watson in The Missing Rembrandt, released by Twickenham Studios in Great Britain in 1932. They made 5 of these movies, moderately well regarded. The New York Times reviewed The Missing Rembrandt very favorably, and the next one, The Triumph of Sherlock Holmes. The Sleeping Cardinal, The Sign of the Four, and Silver Blaze, released in the USA as Murder at the Baskervilles, in an attempt to capitalize on the Sherlock Holmes series, which came out in 39, and they re-released Silver Blaze as Murder at the Baskervilles in 41 in the US, because people were very much liking British films then in the US, and this was, as I say, intended to bring them another Sherlock Holmes. Fairly easy to obtain. You can buy it on DVD. The Triumph of Sherlock Holmes would be my suggestion here. Wantner was an erudite, disciplined Sherlock Holmes, relatively humorless. A man named Lynn Harding often played Professor Moriarty, and he does so in The Triumph of Sherlock Holmes as well. And now we go to the best known of the series of Sherlock Holmes with the next slide, Laura, the poster for the Hound of the Baskervilles. It doesn't get much more lurid than this one, folks. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle gets great billing, but let's stop and look at this poster a minute. This tells us several things. This is the first pairing by 20th Century Fox of Basil Rathbone as Sherlock and Nigel Bruce as Dr. Watson. There would be 2 for Fox and 12 more in the series. Let's focus on this poster. Sherlock Holmes in silhouette and his pipe. They have the standard silhouette Sherlock Holmes pose, deerstalker cap. But what is 20th Century Fox featuring? The scariness of the movie. Look at the way in which the lettering is used on the Hound of the Baskervilles. It almost breathes. Ah, this is mysterious. The Hound of the Baskervilles. Plus it, like all the credits, is on Dutch angle on this poster. You know Dutch angle, I think, where it's not level, but it goes from left up to right. And there it is. And what are they featuring besides that? They're featuring their supporting cast indeed, and they're featuring the romantic angle. There is Wendy Barry, who had played in The Saint Strikes Back with George Sanders, a good recommended Saint movie, and Richard Green, who was an up-and-coming 20th Century Fox romantic lead playing Sir Henry. And Wendy Barry plays his girlfriend across the moor. And notice that billing. The Hound of the Baskervilles with Richard Green, Basil Rathbone, Wendy Barry, Nigel Bruce, Lionel Atwill, etc. Basil Rathbone is second, Bruce is fourth. They weren't sure this would succeed as a movie that was only for detective fans. And so with the vivid colors and the billing of the romantic stars, they tried to put it all together that way. Now we'll look at some of the detail from the highly recommended Hound of the Baskervilles. Let's go to the next slide, Laura, for a scene at Baskerville Hall from the 1939 film. Here on the left, of course, Basil Rathbone with the iconic pipe, hands in pockets. In the chair, Ely Mallion, an actress of the period. We're not going to give away the resolution, but let's say she is making a confession about something she knows to Sir Henry, standing at the right. Looking on to the right of her, John Carradine as Barrymore, her husband, while Mrs. Barrymore tells what she knows. You see the rather stiff, angular setting with the columns and 20th Century Fox putting appropriate design into the picture with all the talents of Richard Day. Everything is there for an A production of The Hound of the Baskervilles. And so we'll go to the next one. Next scene, Laura. The Hound of the Baskervilles, 1959. I thought you might find this interesting. Our slide is black and white. This is a color movie. So you have not Ely Mallion, but Helen Goss, John Le Mesurier as Barrymore. Now we have Dr. Watson, played by Andre Morel, and we have Sherlock Holmes, played by Peter Cushing, the great British character actor of The Curse of Frankenstein, Horror of Dracula, and of course his last film as Governor Tarquin in Star Wars. Same sort of composition. Holmes is now on the right instead of on the left. There's a little more fussiness to the set, a little more detail, carpets on the floor instead of the bare floor, but you get the idea, similar composition. We're moving along fast. We're getting pretty close to the end. Next one, Laura, is a poster for The Pearl of Death. Here I just have a black and white poster, but I wanted to show you something interesting about it. We are now in the 7th of the Pearl of Death is the 7th in the 12 movies made for Universal by Rathbone and Nigel Bruce. Notice this poster, The Pearl of Death. What are we now emphasizing? First, the horror movies, then Marked for Sudden and Violent Death, A Girl in Peril. The masterminds tackle the crimes, Rathbone, Bruce, right? Sir Arthur Conan Doyle at the bottom, the Creeper, the Pearl, the supporting cast. Nowhere do you see the words Sherlock Holmes or Dr. Watson. The first Sherlock Holmes movies in this series featured Sherlock Holmes and the Secret Weapon, the second one. The first one, Sherlock Holmes and the Voice of Terror, Sherlock Holmes in Washington, Sherlock Holmes Faces Death. Then the Sherlock Holmes part was dropped and the later movies did not include the name. When the credits rolled, it said Basil Rathbone as Sherlock Holmes, Nigel Bruce as Dr. Watson, but it never says that on these posters as you get along farther. The best of these, I think, of the 12 Universal is clearly The Scarlet Claw, similar to The Hound of the Baskervilles and set on the moors of a small Canadian village. Every once in a while, we're not quite ready yet, but in just a minute, Laura, every once in a while, a series produces, not a series, but a genre, I meant to say, produces something that is way and above what the rest of the genre has so far produced. And as we wrap up this talk today, I wanted to talk about a really top of the form example. What I mean is something that jumps out and makes you think about an open story instead of a closed story. What was Sam Spade like before the Maltese Falcon story? What were these other characters like after? What did he do next? We start to think in really Class A mystery films about the detective and the solution long after we have forgotten some of the genre films with their plain solutions and their closed construct. Now in the open construct, next slide, Laura, a poster for the Maltese Falcon. Humphrey Bogart, Mary Astor, what does it have in common? It's a color poster lobby card for a black and white film. But getting beyond that, a top tier drama in the detective mode, written by Dashiell Hammett again, who created Sam Spade and The Thin Man and did so many other wonderful detective works and short stories. And so you have a top of the form. What would be other ones that we could do a whole nother program on that are top of the form dramas from the classic period? Perhaps the first one that comes to mind after the Maltese Falcon, and that is A Professional Private Eye, that Sam Spade, who is hired, is not a professional private eye, and that would be, I don't have a poster for it, but And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie, also called 10 Little Indians, made over many times And Then There Were None, 1945 by Renee Clare, clearly the best. And there are others we could talk about that are top of the line. I guess if you want to call Mildred Pierce a murder mystery, you could also throw that in. Something that gets us to say, oh, well, this is different. Just as, for example, as a little kid, if you'll forgive a personal story, I went to Western matinee movies with Roy Rogers and many others at the Broadway Theater in San Antonio, Texas. But when I saw Stagecoach one time, maybe when the Roy Rogers movie didn't come through, they showed a Stagecoach directed by John Ford, which had been in release then for 11 or 12 years. Wow, I knew right away, this wasn't the same old Western anymore. This was something mighty good. And that's what we mean when we talk about something at the top of the form. One last series, Laura, we'll move on to the next slide. Margaret Rutherford, the British actress, starred in 4 Agatha Christie mysteries in the early 60s. Excuse me, I'll get my tongue untangled in a moment. She starred in 4 Agatha Christie mysteries from 61 to 64. Murder, She Said, Murder at the Gallop, Murder Most Foul, and Murder Ahoy. She played Miss Jane Marple. People like her or don't like her as Miss Marple, but the series still survives on television today and is pretty easy to locate. You can get the whole set of all 4 of those together on DVD easily. Margaret Rutherford's dates are 1892 to 1972, and she won a Best Supporting Actress Oscar in 63 for a movie called The VIPs. She really approached Miss Marple with a lot of fun, and those movies are pretty hilarious. Many people like Joan Hickson a little better, who played in the TV series and also had a supporting part in the first one and the recommended one, Murder, She Said, based on 450 from Paddington, a Miss Marple mystery by Agatha Christie. Her husband, Stringer Davis, always appeared as Mr. Stringer, and Charles Tingwell always appeared as Inspector Craddock, who was always 2 steps behind her. We'll leave her up for just a moment while I answer the question I get sometimes. Well, can you give me an example of a modern series that I might be interested in watching today? A modern detective genre series still going in the movies is, of course, James Bond. Now you have to stretch it to the fact that he is a spy, but nevertheless, so were some of these, as in the Lone Wolf Spy Hunt from time to time. James Bond started with Dr. No in 1962 and the great Sean Connery, with Joseph Wiseman as Dr. No, Ursula Andress as the Lady Fair. 1962, and still, as you know, with Daniel Craig, is going even today, the most recent one being eagerly anticipated for prompt release, we hope, sometime after the COVID pandemic allows. But I would think the James Bond series, and of those, why not try the first one? People have many favorites, but Dr. No is a very, very solid film. Then there are those other movies that jump out as pretty interesting. Knives Out, released only a couple of years ago, is an attempt to do a one-off, really good murder mystery and recreate the murder mysteries of the past. 2 that I would recommend also, both came out in 74. They were Murder on the Orient Express. That version, of course, was also a TV series that was very successful. But that movie version with all those stars, with Albert Finney doing a great job as Hercule Poirot, in my opinion. And one of my favorites of the modern movies, Chinatown, of course, with Jack Nicholson as Jake Gittes, the private eye, and that wonderful milieu winning the Academy Award for Best Original Screenplay, Chinatown. As we come to the end of this, and we can leave Margaret Rutherford there, or we can go back to there we go. Thanks for attending. As we come to the end, just a couple of comments. First, on behalf of the library, I invite you back on March the 4th, a Thursday at 1:30, when we will continue our genre conversation with 2 different genres pressed into one program, romances and musicals. We'll talk about the Hollywood romantic comedies, such as The Awful Truth, The More the Merrier, those from the 30s and 40s, Love Affair, An Affair to Remember, and so on, and musicals that we'll talk about, such as Oklahoma and The Music Man, and so forth. And so I want to close with a quotation after inviting you back, one quotation as Laura takes questions, and I have to read it. I like it very much. It's from David McCullough on The Elegant Art of Detection, written in 1984. We'll close with this. More central than the methods and mannerisms of the great detectives is the fact that they cut through confusion and chaos. They solve the puzzle. They set things right. They make the world seem quite a logical place after all. These detectives in the movies restore order. As for their methods and mannerisms, that is where the fun lies. I hope you have had fun with this presentation today. And so I will just turn that over to the questions that Laura might have. And I think we will go from there. Thank you.
Jack, we did get one question from Jim Marshall. What about trial mysteries?
Well, there are indeed. I think most people think of the television Perry Mason series with Raymond Burr, quite long running and quite good. Did you know that there is also a series of trial mysteries with Warren William, who played the lone wolf, playing the role of Perry Mason, Case of the Lucky Legs, and so forth. These go on, they're good, they're there. I just couldn't cover everything. But the trials are interesting, and so often in the Mason movies, as you know, as in the television series so often, it's all about having somebody coming out at the last moment and revealing that they are the guilty party. And you ask yourself, were we fully prepared for that, or was that a surprise? Would Willard Huntington Wright have liked that? In some cases he would. In some cases, I'd think he'd call that an unmotivated confession that comes at the last minute. But one thing there is, I'm told, I've never seen it, a Perry Mason episode on TV in which he actually doesn't quite come to the conclusion. And that leads me to one other factoid. You might try sometime finding mysteries. They are rare, but if you've never seen Orson Welles in a movie called Trent's Last Case, based on the novel by E.C. Bentley, you might want to try that one because the solution is so different and you see the detective a little bit stymied instead of just closing up the case like in most of these. So what other questions do we have today, Laura?
We did have a comment. Is there a creepier scene than John Huston inviting his granddaughter into the car in Chinatown?
Well, I wouldn't want to say there's a creepier scene. There's probably nothing much creepier, but we don't want to be giving away too much of what went on there. It is wonderful that John Huston could have gone on to that second career as an actor after having been such a prolific director, mostly making his movies, you know, off of materials provided from literary sources. You can think of all those novels that he adapted to the screen and brought there with great panache, not just the Maltese Falcon, the African Queen, and so many others, Prizzi's Honor, and really a long career, The Dead from the short story by James Joyce, and then that second career as an actor. And as we found out, he was a pretty good actor, and Chinatown is a pretty good example of his craft. What else we have?
We did have a question. What makes a classic mystery a film noir mystery?
Now film noir is another matter. Film noir is one we may attend to in April. I'm still working to decide on the April 1st program. On April Fool's Day, we're going to do the fourth Thursday. That'll wrap up our series. So film noir, you know, is that different genre. I won't go into the entire history of it here, but it's different from these. And I separated it from the detective genre because, and the series, because as you may know, film noir was not a genre developed like the Western. It wasn't, oh, we're going to make a film noir for quite a while. Later it was. But initially it was a term applied to the novels in France that were banned by the Germans during World War II. And they were bound in black and they were called roman noirs. And they were often about such subjects. And then when we had movies start to come up that had all the elements of mystery and fate, and there's so many ones that are so idiosyncratic that filmed at night, so much of it at night, the man falling for the femme fatale, all of that. Then people went back, critics went back and said, this looks like a genre. And so they established it as film noir, named after those roman noir. And that is an interesting story in itself. But As we get past that, they're similar, all right, but there are a lot more mysteries than there are film noirs, and not all film noirs are mysteries. Some of them are straightforward, following a crime. There's no mystery to the Asphalt Jungle in Who Did It, right? There's no mystery in Double Indemnity. We're following a crime as it is done, all right? So you don't have to be a mystery to be a film noir movie. So it's a fine distinction, but it's a good question. Thank you. Does that wrap it up?
Other questions? Anybody else have something they would like to ask Jack? You can just type it into the chat.
Thank you, Jack.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody. I appreciate all the friends and folks watching this afternoon. I hope to see you again, as I say, on March the 4th. I think
Stay safe.
take care of it, Laura. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thanks.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Welcome.